everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm your host, Katie Dodson. Hopefully, you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media. But if you haven't, you can find us on all the major channels at Hive Systems. Make sure to give us a follow and subscribe. For this month's Hive Live, we'll be talking about advanced persistent threats, who they are, what they do, and how you can keep yourself safe. So let's get into it. First of all, who are APTs? Well, APTs, it's all in the name. They are advanced and persistent. So they are not just your teenager sitting in a basement playing around with code. These are professionals. They tend to work either alone or in groups using more sophisticated malware and techniques to accomplish their goals, normally going after bigger targets. They're also, like I said, persistent. They're going to try over and over and over again to try to hack into their targets, trying different techniques if something doesn't work, and even using specific custom malware to stay on a victim's network for as long as possible without being detected. If you ask anyone who works in intel for the government, they're also going to tell you that APTs are nation state supported. Basically, they are working on behalf of a specific country's government or with permission to operate from that government. Some of these groups are even directly affiliated with a country's military or intelligence operations, which means that they have a lot of resources, whether funding, personnel, tools, or equipment to carry out their attacks. So who are these countries? There are a number of different countries participating in APT activity to accomplish different goals, but there are essentially a big four who've been at it for a very long time that we'll focus on for today. These groups are also tracked by a lot of different intelligence companies, so CrowdStrike, FireEye, Mandiant, to name a few. They all use different names to track these groups, which can make it a little bit challenging to know who's who, where the overlap is. I personally like CrowdStrike's naming system. I find it to be the most fun and easy to understand, so I'm going to stick with theirs for today. So these countries that we're going to focus on are, first of all, China. They are known as Pandas. Iran, which are Kittens. Russia, which are the bears. And then North Korea, or Chollimas, which, if like me, you have to Google what a Chollima is. It is basically a Pegasus, but from North Korean mythology. So before we get into this, just to be clear, Hive Systems is not pointing any fingers here. We did not make any of this attribution. We are not saying that these APTs are affiliated with these countries based on our own assessments. We are completely sourcing this from those intelligence companies like Mandiant, CrowdStrike, and FireEye that I mentioned before, or we're sourcing it from publicly available information in either indictments or public advisories made by the US government. So again, they are making that assessment based on studying the targets that are being used in these campaigns, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that these groups are using, and also the infrastructure they're using to carry out this activity. So again, Hive Systems is just sourcing this from these different intelligence groups. We are not making this attribution ourselves and pointing any fingers. So we will get started here with China. Chinese APTs are generally motivated by espionage and intelligence collection. If you look at some of the technology coming out of China, especially military technology, and compare it to, for example, some military aircraft or maritime vessels that our own military is using, you might see a lot of similarities in that technology. They are exceedingly successful at stealing trade secrets and other intellectual property. So this essentially lets China skip out on years and years of research and development and funding for that research and development, skipping ahead to the end product to have a competitive piece of technology used in their military or in the market as compared to the US and around the world. Roughly every 5 years or so, China also publishes their 5-year plan, which outlines the country's strategic goals for their social and economic development. This 5-year plan is publicly available and translated online. You can Google it, see kind of what their strategy is, what goals they have for the upcoming 5 years, and see if anything that your company is working on aligns with some of that technology. It'll give you a little bit of an idea of whether or not you could be a strategic target for Chinese APTs. The most recent plan was drafted in October 2020. So Chinese APTs do tend to use more sophisticated and wide-ranging techniques. It makes it a little bit harder to identify their activity or attribute it specifically to China. Basically, they can do a lot of different types of attacks, use a lot of techniques that hide their activity, often going undetected on networks for months or even years at a time before they get caught. Some of the more common tactics, techniques, and procedures that they use to initially get on a network are pretty common things like spear phishing, exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, and even using custom malware. We'll get into this more in a little bit, but there was at least one Chinese APT that even compromised to managed service providers in order to conduct a supply chain attack and get onto their customers' networks as well. Because they're constantly evolving their TTPs and using more obfuscation techniques to hide their activity, it's becoming more and more difficult to actually attribute activity to a specific Chinese APT group. Mandiant alone tracks more than 29 different groups coming out of China specifically. And anytime these groups are either indicted or sanctioned by the US government, they just change their techniques and may pop up as a different group or may go undetected for a long period of time before these researchers like Mandiant, CrowdStrike, FireEye, Sentinel Labs, and things like that can identify their activity again. So let's meet the pandas. These are just a couple of those 29 different groups that I mentioned. Comment Panda, also known as APT1 or Comment Crew, has been active since 2006. This group has historically stolen hundreds of terabytes of data from more than 141 organizations worldwide in a whole lot of different industries. They commonly use spear phishing with malicious attachments or hyperlinks, and then custom backdoors to get onto their victims' networks. Stone Panda, also known as APT10 Cicada or Menu Pass, has been active since 2009. These are the guys who were responsible for compromising the managed service providers that I mentioned on the previous slide. They ultimately compromised 9 different MSPs, including HPE and IBM, and used them to get onto the customers to compromise the customer networks as well. They also use spear phishing for their initial intrusion vector. Theirs tend to be a bit less sophisticated, though that does not necessarily mean that they are not successful. Many of their phishing emails end up using files with double extensions or decoy documents, which makes them a little more easily identifiable as spear phishing emails if the victim takes the time to look into it before opening those attachments. Kryptonite Panda, also known as APT40, Gadolinium or Leviathan, has been active since 2009. They also use spear phishing activity to initially compromise their victims. They typically pose as a person of interest, like a journalist or someone from a trade publication or military organization, to target their victims. Most of their targets are of strategic importance to the Belt and Road Initiative, which means that they primarily focus on countries in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, not so much on the United States. Emissary Panda, also known as APT27 Bronze Union or Lucky Mouse, has been active since 2010. Again, they commonly use spear phishing techniques and zero-day exploits to compromise their victims. And then there's Wicked Panda, also known as APT41 Winty or Barium. There's a couple other names for them. These are one of the most prolific and effective China-based APTs. They are consistently evolving and expanding their tool sets to carry out their attacks, and they exploit zero-day and unpatched vulnerabilities pretty frequently. Some of their activity has been most apparent in the video game industry, where they have manipulated virtual currency and attempted to deploy ransomware. So what's China been up to recently? Bronze Starlight, which does not currently have a panda name, they've been discovered by a different research group. They've been using ransomware going back to mid-2021 to hide cyber espionage and intellectual property theft operations. So basically, these APTs were using ransomware, and the researchers have discovered that rather than just simply carrying out a ransomware attack, where of course they're going to demand money to unlock the network, they were using it to hide the activity where they were actually stealing information off of the victim networks. These researchers think that they're conducting espionage specifically because they've used 5 different ransomware families that all had much shorter lifespans. Typically, ransomware lasts for a good couple of months, maybe a couple of years before it gets retired and replaced with a different one. This particular group and campaign have used 5 already since mid-2021. The targets are also of strategic importance to China. So they've hit a pharmaceutical company, a law firm, and a media company in the United States, some other targets in other countries. And the tools that they are using kind of indicate that Bronze Starlight is stealing information, not just demanding ransom payments. There is also a new Chinese APT that researchers have discovered. It's called Aochin Dragon. This group has been conducting attacks completely unnoticed for more than 10 years. Sentinel Labs, they're the researchers who discovered it, identified attacks that were targeting Southeast Asia and Australia dating all the way back to 2013. They have evaded detection because they've evolved a lot over time. So this group initially, way back in 2013, was using weaponized Word documents, tricking their victims into opening the documents and downloading malware. Pretty common technique. Then they evolved into luring their users to click on shortcuts on their desktop that looked like antivirus. So they would install malware, but use a fake shortcut icon so that people thought they were actually running antivirus and not downloading malware. And then most recently, they are using a technique making it look like a removable device folder is open on the computer. So the victims are double-clicking the removable device folder to see what's in it and are inadvertently downloading malware, which then also looks for actual removable devices, copies itself to those USBs or other removable devices, and propagates and gets spread further as soon as you plug it into a new device. And then last but not least, Stone Panda, that's APT-10, has also recently expanded their targeting. In the past, they primarily focused on Japanese-linked countries, but since mid-2021, they're also now targeting Europe, Asia, and North America. Their most recent activity from February 2022 saw that there was some initial attack activity happening on Microsoft Exchange servers, leading researchers to believe that there is probably an Exchange server vulnerability that was being used in order to get onto the network and deploy custom backdoors. In one victim in particular, they even spent up to 9 months on their network before they were detected. So moving on to our Iranian APTs, China, much more sophisticated. Now moving on to Iran, they are much less sophisticated and pretty noisy. They use a lot of spear phishing and social engineering. They're a bit easier to detect and attribute the activity to because they're not quite as sneaky. It also means that if you know how to recognize the activity, you may be able to block it earlier in the attack chain before anything happens on your network. They are generally motivated by espionage or tracking dissidents within Iran rather than the more large-scale intellectual property theft that we see from China-based APTs. As I mentioned, they focus primarily on spear phishing and social engineering, especially using LinkedIn, Telegram, and Facebook for their activity. They've also been seen exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities and deploying ransomware, and are more likely to use wiper malware than other APT groups. So as I go through some of these groups with the different kittens, you'll probably see a lot of overlap in the kinds of activity that Iran-based APTs carry out. So again, you can see a lot of spear phishing, social engineering activity. Refined Kitten, also known as APT-33 or Elfin, has been active since 2013. They are responsible for one of the most destructive cyber attacks in history. Not sure if anyone remembers the 2012 attack on Saudi Aramco. The oil conglomerate was hit with Shamoon malware, wiped more than 35,000 computers of that company. And unlike ransomware, where you can pay to get that back, the wiper malware just destroyed everything, and they essentially had to rebuild all of those devices from scratch. Refined Kitten also uses spear phishing, password spraying, domain masquerading, and brute force attacks to compromise their victims, often using recruitment themes and fake job application websites. Rampant Kitten has been active since 2014. They tend to use infostealer malware and ransomware against their targets. They tend to focus more on KeyPass and Telegram, so not quite as prevalent in targeting the US. Rocket Kitten, also known as Charming Kitten, Newscaster, or Phosphorus, has been active since 2010. They use social engineering, social media phishing, spear phishing, and Microsoft Office vulnerabilities to carry out their attacks. Researchers have determined that this particular group is likely acting on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they're known for more complex and long-term social engineering campaigns. Helix Kitten, also known as APT-34, Oil Rig, Greenbug, a couple other names, have been active since 2014. They also conduct spear phishing and social engineering. They've also been observed using DNS tunneling and Microsoft Office vulnerabilities to get onto their victims' networks. And more recently, they have also used wiper malware, similar to the Shamoon malware used by Refine Kitten. This malware was called Zero Clear and was used against energy companies in the Middle East. Remix Kitten, also known as APT-39 and Schaefer, has been active since 2014 as well. Researchers believe that this group is conducting cyber espionage on behalf of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, but they're doing it through a front company called Rana Intelligence Computing. Using front companies is another common technique used by Iranian APTs. They use spear phishing, social engineering, and SQL injection to conduct their attacks, primarily against targets in the travel and hospitality sectors. They tend to go after travel and hospitality organizations that collect a lot of personal information, which indicates that this group is probably motivated by tracking dissidents more than anything else. Pioneer Kitten, also known as Fox Kitten Parasite or UNC 757, has been active since 2017. They more commonly exploit unpatched vulnerabilities to deploy web shells on their victim networks. And their targets are primarily in healthcare, government, technology, and defense. And then last but not least, one of the most active APTs is Static Kitten. They're more frequently referred to as Muddy Water or Seedworm. You might have heard about Muddy Water in the news. They primarily use spear phishing to conduct their attacks, and their focus tends to be on government, tourism, and telecommunications. So as I mentioned, Muddy Water might be more commonly heard in the news. They've been involved in a couple different campaigns, primarily targeting the Middle East. So one campaign from November 2021 was targeting Turkish government entities. They basically were using malicious Excel and PDF documents sent through phishing emails. Those documents were masquerading as legitimate documents from Turkish Health and Interior Ministries in order to get their victims to open them. One of the targets included the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. And then for the other campaign, there was actually a joint advisory released by FBI, CISA, and the Australian and UK governments about this one. They basically were saying that Static Kitten was exploiting Fortinet vulnerabilities since March 2021 and proxy shell vulnerabilities since October 2021 in order to target US critical infrastructure, transportation, and public health. And then going back to the social engineering that we saw a lot of these APTs using, Facebook actually shut down a large cyber espionage campaign that was being conducted by Charming Kitten. This campaign was primarily targeting military personnel and then defense and aerospace companies. They created a whole bunch of fake online personas that were, masquerading as recruiters or employees of other aerospace and defense companies that their targets were in. And they were even having conversations and engaging with their targets for months before they were shut down or discovered. They also set up a whole lot of different fake domains that were shut down as part of this campaign. The domains typically covered a variety of interests to get their victims to provide login credentials. And this is how Charming Kitten was essentially getting login credentials, but also information about their victims' computers so that they could deliver tailored malware. All right, so moving on to our Russian APTs. Russia tends to be a little bit more sophisticated, but also noisy. So they kind of fall right in the middle between the China-based APTs that were sophisticated and sneaky and the Iranian APTs that are unsophisticated and noisy. Russia basically is so good at what they do when it comes to cyber attacks that they don't really have to worry about being discovered because it's not going to stop them from continuing their activity. They have a wide range of motives, anything from intelligence collection to espionage and financial gain. And as I mentioned, more sophisticated, a lot more custom malware. But as far as initially getting on the network, they're still using a lot of those easier, low-hanging fruit type of activities like spear phishing, password spraying, and exploiting your public-facing applications. So when it comes to Russian APTs, there's two primary groups that you might hear about, Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. I did include Venomous Bear here. They're more commonly known as Turla. They are primarily focused on obtaining diplomatic intelligence, so not necessarily something you're going to see targeting specific US companies as often, but they are still one of the major APT groups coming out of Russia. So Fancy Bear, also known as APT-28, Zebracy, or Sophacy, has been active since 2004. They use a lot of different attack techniques. You can see it right here in this table. Includes password spraying, brute force attacks, spear phishing, exploiting public-facing applications, weaponized Word documents, and they're also involved in denial of service attacks. Researchers have attributed this group specifically to one of Russia's General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate military units, and they are well known for hacking the 2016 DNC to interfere with the US presidential election. They were also caught hacking the World Anti-Doping Agency back in 2016. They stole a whole lot of different confidential information about Olympic athletes and began publicly releasing that information ahead of the Olympic Games, basically trying to get information out there about any medical conditions that these athletes might have and any therapeutic use exemptions that they had as a result as well. The hack of the World Anti-Doping Agency was carried out with a simple spear phishing attack. Cozy Bear, also known as APT-29 or the Dukes, has been active since 2008. Researchers attributed this group to Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, and they are well known for large-scale phishing campaigns, often using mailing services like Constant Contact to hit a wide range of targets. They are particularly persistent and will continue their attacks against targets even after they've been identified and kicked off of your network. And they will attempt to reestablish their connections through any means that they can, or deploy malware that, if they're discovered in one spot and kicked out, has a backdoor to get back on. Cozy Bear was actually the group that was behind the large-scale SolarWinds supply chain attack back in 2020. So what have the Russia-based APTs been up to lately? As you can probably imagine, they've been a little bit caught up in the ongoing war with Ukraine. These APTs are now more focused on Ukraine using wiper malware and spear phishing attacks. Fancy Bear in particular has recently been conducting 2 spear phishing attacks, one using unpaid taxes and nuclear terrorism themes to get their targets to open an attachment that delivers Cobalt Strike or Credo Map malware. The other spear phishing attack uses a nuclear war theme against their targets. When you open the malicious attachment in that email, it exploits the one-click Microsoft flaw that's been in the news recently called Felina. This malware steals credentials from Chrome, Firefox, and Edge browsers, and then Fancy Bear uses those credentials for further attacks. Then Cozy Bear has recently added Google Drive and Dropbox to their attack chain. Using legitimate cloud storage services is not new for Cozy Bear. They've definitely done it before. It's just that the use of Dropbox and Google Drive is new. They were seen in conducting attacks back in early May, including malicious attachments that called out to Dropbox and Google Drive in order to continue their attacks. This particular spear phishing campaign targeted Western diplomatic missions in Brazil and Portugal. They used already compromised email accounts of a NATO country to send an attachment to the ambassadors of Brazil and Portugal, looking like an agenda for an upcoming meeting with the compromised ambassador's account. And then moving on to the last of our big 4, we have North Korea. North Korea-based APTs are heavily focused on generating revenue. They're one of the biggest nation-state supported groups that are targeting cryptocurrency specifically. Their attacks also tend to be less sophisticated, using a lot of spear phishing and social engineering, similar to what we've seen with the other groups. They also combine those with malicious Office documents to carry out their attacks. And while they're less sophisticated, they do tend to be successful. There is also significant overlap in the different APT groups coming out of North Korea. So just to add to the confusion, one researcher may have a number of different groups that another researcher thinks are all the same person. So there is quite a bit of overlap with the APT names that we're going to see on the next slide. So going into the Chollimas. So Labyrinth Chollima and Stardust Chollima both are linked to Lazarus Group. Lazarus Group is probably one of the most common North Korean APT names that you can see in the news. And then Silent Cholima, which is also called Indarial, is a subset of Lazarus Group. So out of the four we're talking about today, 3 of them are linked with Lazarus Group specifically. Labyrinth Chollima, which we are going to call Lazarus Group for today, and Hidden Cobra is one of the most prolific North Korea-based APTs. They use brute force attacks, social engineering, especially focusing on LinkedIn, spear phishing, and malicious documents to carry out their highly successful attacks. And this group was also responsible for the 2014 destructive attack against Sony. Stardust Cholima, again overlapping with Lazarus Group, has been active since 2014, and they specialize in financial cyber operations. They've used watering hole and brute force attacks, as well as spear phishing and ransomware to get bigger payouts from the companies that they attack. They are most notorious for the 2016 Bank of Bangladesh attack, where they stole $81 million worth of money from the bank. Silent Cholima, also known as Indarial, is a subset of Lazarus Group. They've been active since 2009, using spear phishing, malicious documents, and zero-day exploits against their targets, which are primarily South Korean government and military. They also conduct cyber attacks against ATMs, banks, and crypto exchanges. And while their earlier campaigns were focused on espionage and destructive attacks, they've now shifted more towards intelligence collection against those South Korean targets. And then last, we have Ricochet Cholima, also known as Scarcroft or APT-37. They've been active since 2012 and are also primarily focused on South Korea, though they have expanded their targeting to some Eastern and Middle Eastern countries as well. They have used wiper malware in destructive attacks, conduct strategic web compromises, and spear phishing against their targets, who are often non-government organizations, academics, journalists, and defectors. So in the news, Stardust Cholima has been heavily targeting organizations working in blockchain and cryptocurrency. They have been posing as recruiters, often offering high-paying jobs in the crypto and blockchain markets, using social engineering to target employees who work for different crypto companies, primarily in their development and IT positions. Some of the targeted companies have ranged from crypto exchanges to decentralized finance protocols, play-to-earn crypto video games, crypto trading companies, venture capital funds investing in cryptocurrency, and even individual holders of large amounts of cryptocurrency and valuable NFTs. The FBI, CISA, and Treasury also recently released a joint advisory warning that North Korean APTs were targeting U.S. healthcare and public health sectors using Maui ransomware. At the time, the APT group itself has not been named. We just know that it is coming from North Korea. These APTs are encrypting servers that are responsible for a number of different healthcare services, including electronic health records, diagnostics, imaging, and intranet services in order to get a larger payout to get these systems back online. Maui ransomware is unique because it is not sold as a service on the dark web like most other ransomware. Instead, it is designed and privately used by state-backed actors. And then there's Lazarus Group. Lazarus Group has been involved in a very long-term campaign called Operation Dream Job. It's been going on since at least 2020 that combines spear phishing and social engineering to achieve their goals. They are focused on targets in defense, government, engineering, and aviation, recently also expanded to include the chemical sector. And they're, again, posing as recruiters offering jobs at particularly prominent aerospace and defense companies. Some of them, for example, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems. They are engaging with victims at the target companies, luring them into opening malicious job offer themed documents in order to deploy ransomware and begin their attacks. And then separately in the news, OFAC also recently attributed the Ronin network attack to Lazarus Group. In that attack, more than $540 million worth of cryptocurrency was stolen. So now that we've talked about all the big four, that's all you have to worry about, right? Unfortunately, no. We also have our cyber criminal groups. So CrowdStrike buckets these into spiders. So unlike APTs, cyber criminals generally are not operating on behalf of a specific country's government, but that does not mean that they are not advanced or persistent. Cyber criminals, as you can imagine, are motivated by financial gain, and they operate heavily on the dark web. Basically, these different cyber criminal groups will design malware or ransomware and then sell it on the dark web as a service, or they'll use it themselves to carry out their attacks. Selling the malware or ransomware as a service lets anyone, sophisticated or not, carry out their attacks. They tend to be highly successful because these professionals are even offering an interface for these attackers to customize and design their attacks. They will design the malware for them, so it takes out the hardest part. They'll even offer customer service to anyone who buys their malware to carry out their attacks. Many of these cyber criminals also steal information and sell it on the dark web to make more money, commonly seen in double extortion ransomware attacks, where criminals will first get money for demanding a ransom to unlock your network that they have locked with ransomware, but then also stealing your information and demanding a second payment in order to not release that information publicly on the dark web in order to get victims to pay for more. So as I mentioned, most cyber criminals will sell malware and ransomware as a service on the dark web. So that does not necessarily mean that every attack using a specific type of malware or ransomware is being conducted by the group that designed it. Wizard Spider is known for Ryuk and Conti ransomware. Ryuk had one of the highest single ransom demands of 2019, demanding $12.5 million from a single victim. By the end of 2020, researchers believe that Ryuk ransomware had netted about $151 million in ransomware payouts. Ryuk usually gets onto a network using spear phishing that then deploys TrickBot before ultimately deploying Ryuk onto a victim network. Most ransomware will kind of last for a little while and then get phased out and replaced with a different ransomware. So when Ryuk got phased out, it was replaced with Conti. Conti is also typically deployed through spear phishing or through exploitation of weak RDP credentials, which then uses TrickBot, Cobalt Strike, or Bazar Loader to deploy the Conti ransomware. To date, Conti has attacked more than 400 organizations worldwide and often exfiltrates data prior to encrypting so that they can use double extortion techniques to get more money. Basically what I was talking about on the previous slide with getting money for unlocking your network and then getting more money for not releasing the information that they stole from your network. Twisted Spider is known for Maze and egregor ransomware. Maze was usually deployed through exploit kits, spam campaigns, and compromised RDP credentials. Similar to how Ryuk was replaced with Conti, Maze was ultimately replaced by egregor. Egregor was deployed onto networks using QuackBot, which was deployed following successful spear phishing attacks or exploitation of weak VPN or RDP credentials. Maze and egregor are also known for double extortion techniques. Pinchy Spider is known for GanCrab and Revil Sodinokibi ransomware. As of December 2021, GanCrab was thought to be responsible for more than 40% of all ransomware infections worldwide. And then when that was phased out, it was replaced by Revil Sodinokibi. This ransomware is typically spread through brute force attacks or phishing and is responsible for one of the biggest ransomware-related cyber attacks in recent history. Revil Sodinokibi was used in the attack on Kaseya. Ultimately, that trickled down to Kaseya's customers and encrypted their customers' networks as well. Pinchy Spider also hosts a dedicated leak site on the dark web where they keep data stolen from Revil victims to sell to other criminals. Doppelspider is considered a big game hunter, which means that they use Doppelpaymer ransomware and other ransomware to target companies that are more likely to give them the biggest payout. Doppelpaymer is deployed through malicious spam and spear phishing campaigns that download Emotet and Dridex before deploying the Doppelpaymer ransomware. Carbonac, Carbon Spider, also known as Carbonac or Fin7, has been active since 2013. It's another big game hunter like Doppelspider. They're known for the use of DarkSide and REvil ransomware. DarkSide is the ransomware that was used to hack Colonial Pipeline, which disrupted fuel supply on the United States East Coast for days following that cyber attack. So as you can see, most of these groups, well, all of these groups have targeted pretty much every industry that there is. They often go after targets of opportunity rather than targets that are of particular interest to a country's government, like the APTs that we discussed earlier. But the unique one of this bunch is Cobalt Spider. Cobalt Spider initially focused on Russian targets, but have since expanded their targeting to Europe, the Middle East, and Central and South America. Their attacks generally involve spear phishing, where they impersonate other financial institutions to deliver malware to financial institutions. So in the news, every day there's some new news about ransomware. Back in April, Conti was able to gain access to the Costa Rican government in a relatively unsophisticated but successful attack. They used compromised credentials to gain access via VPN, encrypted the government's network, and demanded $10 million after stealing 672 gigs of data. The government did refuse to pay and ultimately had to declare a state of emergency in May as they tried to recover their networks. And then in news that only just came out this week, Entrust digital security firm confirmed that they were a victim of a ransomware attack. The investigation is still ongoing, so there are very few details out there. Don't even know which group is behind the activity yet. And it's also unclear whether only corporate data was impacted. That these attackers did purchase already compromised credentials off the dark web and used those to gain access and steal data from Entrust's internal systems before deploying ransomware. And then finally, Cybercriminals have also been marketing a new version of their free-to-use Redeemer ransomware builder on hacker forums. So basically, this ransomware builder has a built-in feature that provides the group that created it with 20% of the proceeds from any ransom payments that are made, but it allows any unsophisticated attacker to carry out ransomware attacks. Basically, anyone who wants to can go on the dark web, download the free-to-use Redeemer ransomware builder, completely build out their ransomware attack, and then if it's successful, they get the payout, and 20% of it goes to the people who designed Redeemer in the first place. So I know we've covered a lot. There are a whole lot of different groups out there that may be interested in hacking into the information your company has, whether it's to steal trade secrets, redirect money, steal PII, and sell it on the dark web. But there are a lot of common themes here. Many of these groups are usually carrying out these attacks with pretty simple techniques like spear phishing and exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities. If you know what to look for, or if you configure your networks to be secure, you can avoid a lot of these attacks that are being carried out. Phishing and social engineering tend to be successful because they're easy and they rely on the weakest link in any security strategy, which is people. Understanding how to recognize phishing is critical to preventing a large number of attacks and can be accomplished through things like training and phishing exercises. Similarly, recognizing social engineering and not clicking on links from strangers on the internet can help stop a lot of attacks, as can having strong passwords and multi-factor authentication mechanisms. It's also important to monitor for patches for any vendors that you're using in your networks, especially when it comes to zero-day vulnerabilities and other out-of-band security patches, and applying them as quickly as possible to prevent those vulnerabilities from being exploited to gain access to your network. When it comes to all the different ransomware that's being used by cybercriminals, it's important to back up your networks so that you have as little interruption as possible if you do become a victim of a ransomware attack. EDR solutions can also help detect and prevent ransomware attacks before they even happen. And one thing that's really important to know if you do become the victim of a ransomware attack is do not pay the ransom. The Treasury Department has actually released an advisory to let US companies know that if they pay ransoms, they may be in violation of sanctions. And it's also not a guarantee that you will get your network back if you do pay, especially if they're using double extortion and have stolen your data and are going to demand more money over and over again in order to not release your data. So if you do become a victim of a ransomware attack, there are a lot of resources available with the US government right now in order to help try to mitigate that attack. And if you work with the government in this case, they are here to help. Not exactly something that everybody wants to hear, but they are available to help kind of get your network back online, mitigate the activity, and help get you around some of those very expensive payments. And then finally, do get help. If you're not sure if your organization is ready to combat the threats from APTs and ransomware, Hive Systems is offering vulnerability assessments, strategy development, and even phishing simulations and awareness training that can help assess your security posture and give you some peace of mind. So that's all the time we have today. We want to thank you for joining us for our discussion about understanding advanced persistent threats. As always, our experts here at Hive Systems can make your cybersecurity journey more approachable. So please reach out anytime by visiting us at www.hivesystems.io. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we're going to be talking about another exciting topic from the world of cybersecurity, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react.